I am here alongside of you to upend the system that is killing you every day. And Rachel, Aaron Gogans, who was one of the founders of Black Lives Matter and is just an incredible thought leader, he talks about this idea of liberation logic and how we really want to be working towards a place where we're co-creating the world that is going to be really fulfilling for all of us, in a world where everyone's needs are met. And that world is not the world that we have right now, where I see the injustice of the system and we're tearing that system down, but also like, what does it look like for us to work together and rebuilding something? So when we talk about the idea of accomplice versus ally, it's really more getting us to think about how to shift into a more active role. The other question that I'm going to cover is a question about anti-racism and capitalism. The person said something to the gist of like, I've heard a lot of people say that this is also about anti-capitalism. Is it possible to be anti-racist? Do you have to be anti-capitalist? Look, there are worlds where capitalism exists, and before we all agree that the thing that we're here to do is make money, we agree on things like health care, education, clean air and water, access to transportation. There are worlds that are capitalist economies, but their social contract is different than what the social contract has been in the United States. Capitalism, as we've seen it in the United States, there was no like pre-game social contract that was like, hey, before we all decide that the most valuable thing is capital, we're going to lie some guidelines for what are the human values that we're going to work out first. That's not what we've got here. In the US, from the start, we have been willing to build systems where no matter what, the value of wealth, of capital, is number one, ahead of healthcare, ahead of all human needs, ahead of valuing the earth in any kind of way, or setting guidelines around how we're going to exploit the earth. So in the US particularly, it's really hard for us to think about how could we be anti-racist and also continue to participate in capitalism in the way that we've seen capitalism in the US, because capital in the US has been holds no bars in terms of setting any sort of human value first. And within anti-racism, we're interrogating all of the systems that are compromising people's human value. And we're thinking about how it is that we can work so that we eliminate the systems that compromise the value of people, okay? And in capitalism in the US, we've seen things go as far as that we're thinking about how to monetize, and we're thinking about how to monetize basic human needs. We're thinking about how can we make things that should be rights commodities? And that willingness to be exploitive on that level, I think, makes it really hard for us to imagine how could we be anti-racist when this is what American capitalist values are. And always in capitalism as we know it in America, the human value that has been the most devalued has been Black and Indigenous lives. And capitalism as we know it, in like our fetishization of incredible wealth where, you know, what in God's name could Mike Bloomberg ever do with $60 billion, right? And truly, we should be thinking about like, what's going on with a person whose hole is so deep that they need $60 billion to fill it? No, instead we're like, Mike Bloomberg, you know, hell of a businessman. So like that kind of value shift is something we need to be really critical of, like what's going on with us, because we should be thinking about, oh my God, for him to have $60 billion, that means that like $60 billion worth of human needs aren't being covered. And in addition to that, what kind of exploitation has had to happen for one person to accrue $60 billion? And so there's some really good work where that really outlines all of the ways that, you know, American capitalism has been a system where we have originally, obviously, right, our US was founded on free labor and stealing land, right? So first of all, we're talking about incredible exploitation of Black labor, generations of Black labor. So imagine, like, close your eyes, imagine you work your entire life for not a single dollar. And during that life, you have a child and they work their entire life for not a single dollar. And they have a child and they work their entire life for not a single dollar, and towards the middle of the end of their life, maybe they become a sharecropper. And then maybe after a really long time, those sharecroppers were able to have access to being able to own a teeny tiny piece of land after many generations of their family helped to develop incredible wealth for the landowners of that land. And then what I want you to do is I want you to go to Reveal, and I want you to go to 1619, and I want you to think about the experiences of I want you to listen to the experiences of Black farmers in the US and the way that modern capitalism, as we've built it and are believing in it, continue to rob and exploit Black families around land through our banking system and through corruption of loans, and by not giving Black farmers the loans that they need so that they can continue to farm on their land and sustain themselves. So, and in regard to the police, the other thing that we really need to study and think about is all the ways that the police have defended capitalism in ways that are really violent and have permitted and made space for white wealth while completely disenfranchising entire Black and brown communities. The other thing that I would say, just like as we're thinking about, like, okay, is there space for anti-capitalism, for anti-racism and capitalism? I want to think about some of the big, like, what are some of the big social phenomenons that are like money makers in the US? The NFL is another space for us to be really critical about. Is it possible for us to be anti-racist and maintain capitalism? Look at the structures. Check out the book, $14 Million Slave. So I'm going to put some of the homework back on you all. But leaving this question, I also think it's really important that we also think about, in the spirit of anti-racism, it's really a spirit of possibility. And we're thinking about how to build a world that's punctuated by liberation. And so as you've interfaced with capitalism, for you and your experience in capitalism, how much of that has been about liberation? How much of that has been about cultivating a sense of possibility just for you in your life? And, you know, the thinking around abolition and thinking with an anti-racism, they're possibility politics. And I think probably, certainly for me, when I dig into the politics of capitalism, they're not possibility politics. And so I don't know how we would be able to maintain capitalism while simultaneously pursuing an anti-racist logic. But I also think it's something that we should discover individually and in the terms that make sense in our own lives.
So Kate, somebody asked a question in the Q&A that relates specifically to what you were talking about. So how do you make a living without participating in capitalism?
So like I was saying before, there are markets, right, where we don't have to have like, it's like the kind of capitalism we have, it's like a really real, it's like the triangles like this, right? Where we need so much labor at the bottom that is not even for a living wage, right? Because the capitalism that is required for very few people to be as rich as the capitalism that we need in America is a capitalism where there's never enough low labor, right? we need tons and tons and tons of people working at wages that they would never be able to support themselves, or never be able to like just work one job. There is a way for us to think about like, what does it look like to restructure so that it's not possible for, you know, what do they say? Like the 10 most richest people in the world have more of the, I mean, it's like some crazy thing, but like the money that's at the top is an exorbitant amount of money for a very, very few number of people. So I think that, you know, I don't think that we're working towards a like, okay, any kind of commerce is like out the window. But I think that we can move to a space like what we're seeing right now, where we're saying like, no, we see that the only thing the police do is defend wealth of, you know, people, property owners. We need to distribute that money towards the community. So by shifting around the way we share resources, that's a huge start in thinking about, you know, capitalism as we've seen it in America looking really different. And I think that it's going to be something where it's going to be a shift. I think that probably it's going to require us to really go deeper in the overall consciousness of, you know, what people are actually owed in America. And I think that, you know, the more that we can understand truly the debt, like what is owed to Black and particularly Black and Indigenous America, we're gonna have to think really, because also it's even just weird that we say that like, oh, this is just a capitalist market, because, you know, truly the people who end up like getting the most payouts, it's not the people at the bottom, it's the people at the top. So I guess I'm going a lot of places and you're like, okay, how do I not participate? I think our fight has to be in like where we want our money to go and what we want our social values to be, and how can it's kind of like this. Don't worry about capitalism. Let's go all in on what our values are, and then let's think about how do we fund those values.
Yeah, that to me I think of immediately like supporting local booksellers versus Amazon, like not spending your money at corporations that support Trump and all of the other, you know, social structures that have kept a lot of this in place. Another question that was asked was, how do we keep our leaders accountable? And I wasn't quite sure if that was political leaders or leaders at businesses, so I'm going to kind of just cover both. Political leaders, you need to make sure that they fulfill the demands of the protesters. Right now we're seeing demands in Detroit, for example, are not being met by our mayor at all. He is now asking the artistic community to come out and like paint a bunch of Black Lives Matter stuff, and the entire artistic community is like, no, not until you meet the demands of the protesters. So it's about continually calling your city council members, your mayor's office, your county commissioners, your state representatives, your governors, and just continuing to make sure that they're aware that this isn't going away. I think that's like the main thing, aside from being out in the streets and protesting, to keeping these leaders accountable, is really to just show them that this is still an issue. Like, it seems like folks are starting to like pretend that this didn't happen, but it's really important for all of us to continue to participate in making those demands seen, heard, and responded to. In terms of workplace, that's a little bit more challenging, I think, because I don't work in a normal workplace, but I think, and I have some resources that I'll share in the chat on this. I think a big thing is, somebody asked this a couple, like not maybe the first session, and I was like, well, if they're racist, then just quit. And my partner was like, it's COVID and people can't just quit their jobs, and you need to come up with a better answer. which is very true. So my better answer is, how do you keep your bosses accountable for stuff like this? It's seeing how they show up right now. Are they just posting the black square? Are they actually doing an internal review on this, on the company that you work for? Are they like looking at their hires? Are they looking at where Black and POC folks are in, you know, the rankings of how much money people are making? Are they all at the bottom? Are there people in middle management? Are there people at the top? Like, what, you know, are they reflecting on their social values within their company, and are they recognizing that those values are being met or not being met? And if they're not doing that, I'm considering the idea of like what it would look like for workers to petition, sign, you know, pass on something to have folks sign. You can get enough folks within your company to sign that these are values that you all share and you want your company to share them. You know,
There's also a, go ahead.
What's that?
I was saying there's also a great project happening right now called Pull Up or Shut Up. And it's an accountability project.
Can you tell me more about that?
It's an accountability project where where companies that are stating these kind of like empty statements are being asked in a very public forum to be like, okay, well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about what your commitments are. Let's look at who's on your board. Look at who's in leadership. Let's look at salaries. Let's look at your, like, what does it actually look like for you as a business to have clear demands. And so, yeah, it's been pretty effective so far.
That's great. Yeah, I feel like there's so much that we can do as like a collective. You know, if you think about how many people work in a workplace and how many people are at the top, you know, if they have enough momentum and initiative from the mass, the employees, then they're going to, you know, potentially feel required to respond and actually show up. And then the other question was, how do we keep the momentum going, particularly as I think protests are starting to wane a little bit after 2 weeks. You know, I think people are starting to get tired, and this is a lot of what I was talking about in the last couple sessions was like, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Like, you need to keep showing up. You need to keep being present in these protests. So it's not just showing up there, it's also showing up in your community, in your family. And I do feel like, unfortunately, 3 people die a day from police brutality on average. So we're going to continue to have martyrs in this space. We're going to continue to see the names, you know, with a hashtag at the front of them. We're going to continue to see the stories of unarmed Black men being shot by police. Like, that's going to continue to happen, which means the momentum's going to continue. So I do feel like, you know, we need to all be present in having these conversations on every platform we can, but also showing up physically, and also just continuing to talk about it on social media and keep pushing the conversation. And again, holding your representatives accountable is going to also keep that momentum going, because we have to, this doesn't change until laws change. This doesn't change until police structures are demolished and we've created new systems that keep people safe. And so we have to keep having those conversations. And so I think it's just like, make sure you know, spend your time doing this instead of spending your time watching a TV show or something like that. It's really about like building that movement muscle for yourself, and being present in sort of the shift. It just has to be continuous. It has to be something that we all commit to as a lifestyle change, not just like something that we do for 2 weeks because this is the trendy thing that's happening right now. Now I will get into another question. While speaking with the older generations of white people, where do we begin talking about anti-capitalist ideas after decades of national foreign policy that defended it? I like the idea of naming our values first. I often hear younger generations called entitled. Is it too confrontational to flip the concept of entitlement, such as why are the police entitled to the city budget, or why do some think their wealth is deserved? I will pose that to both of you while I focus on that.
I think a lot of these things they're important questions, but they're also really intellectual questions. And I think some of this is also, there's kind of two things that have to be happening. There's work that's happening at the municipal level that I think is really important, for sure. Also, yeah, the police system has to change. School has to change. All these things have to change. But more, we have to change. We, in the way that we exist in the world and how we see ourselves and the narratives that we're filled with and the things that we've accepted about who it is that we are and what it is that we come from and what we believe in and how we come to be in relationship with one another and how we come to be in relationship with the earth. It's deeper spiritual work that we have to do that then is going to be able to put us into a place where we can stand really confidently in our like deep inner knowing as members of humanity that I'm sorry if you come from colonizers like I do, if you come from slave owners like many people who I know do, if you come from immigrants who came to the US and you were able to be naturalized and then internalize this narrative of like the good working immigrant. We come from generations of believing lies about who it is that we are, and those lies have served us to develop narratives about other people, and those narratives have enabled us to be completely complacent in participating in systems that have murdered, disenfranchised both people and the earth. And so I think that a lot of this is about kind of like, yeah, we need to come up with strategy about how we work with each other and talk to each other. But we also need to think about like, how do we talk to each other about like, look, we live in a country right now where Black parents can't trust that their kids can go outside and that the rest of us is going to make sure that those kids aren't going to get murdered by the police who we trust. We need to let like that truth change inside of us. We need to really feel like, where have we been? And change that deeper part of like, why are we disconnected from like feeling that George Floyd's daughter, who there's like beautiful video of like her on his shoulders and they're spinning around, she's not going to ever touch her dad ever again. That, you know, many, many, many mothers in America have been begging us to feel what it feels like to have their child robbed from them. And many, many, many people in America are walking around fucking terrified that, let's say the police don't kill you. Let's say they just snatch you up and beat you into a false confession, and then you spend a zillion years in prison. We need to move into what's happening, like how we become disconnected with our humanity. So like we're okay walking around with that stuff happening and not feeling it. And so I love this idea of how do we take up conversations around like entitlement or like what's deserved. And I would also ask us to like go deeper into like what's underneath that in terms of like the way you live in your body and you know, entertain the narratives that help kind of like create the construction of how you see your life or what's possible for you and what's, you know, what are the limits and the confines of your life. You need to get in there and go deeper underneath like the entitlement piece, the deserving piece, the connection piece. So I'm sorry that I didn't totally answer this question the way it was asked, but I just think there's some other stuff underneath it that we really need to get into, because if we just live in this intellectual world, maybe we'll change some of the systems, but we're not going to change ourselves. And it is ourselves and the way we have felt and the way we have intuitively learned to build relationships, you know, it's that's maintaining these systems also.
To kind of add on to that too, going in a slightly different direction of like educating, because I think there was a question asked about this too, like when we see overt or even like subversive racism, like how do we use that to educate folks? And I think kind of this, sometimes we exist in these circles where we're like anti-capitalist, abolish the police, like where the people around us in our like everyday lives maybe are like, yeah, I'm down. But our grandparents or our parents are not existing in this ecosystem, right? So we're kind of their link to that ideology, and maybe we don't come at it with that strong of language right away because we know our community members that they may not respond to that very well, right? And I think that there's still ways to talk about those ideas without having such like strong language all the time, and I do think strong language is important. I want to make that clear. Like I don't think we should like lessen our ask of like abolishing prisons or abolishing police. I think it's important that people do start asking like, what does this mean? So I'm not advocating for that, but I think we all exist within communities, right? Everybody lives in a community, and that could be your group of friends, that could be your family members, you're maybe a coach or a teacher, whatever it is. You're in a community where you are a trusted messenger, which means people in your community are going to trust you because you're you, and they trust you as a person. And so I think like we know how to respond to the people in our community. So for example, my dad reached out to me 3 weeks ago and was like, I'm worried about you and the ignorant people out here. And what I knew he was saying from that, because he's my dad and I know him, was that he was kind of going on this like anti-looting, anti-rioting, right, like idea, and he's worried about me being involved with something like that. And so before I reached out to my dad to talk to him, I thought about it and I talked with some friends about like, how am I going to approach my dad? And I know with him, like I can talk to him about because his whole idea was, we should be engaging in peaceful protests, and I don't understand why people aren't doing this peacefully. And so I used something that I know he connects with. My dad is really, really into sports. I said, Dad, you are the same person who looked at Colin Kaepernick, who was kneeling peacefully, and said that was disrespectful to veterans, right? So we need to look at the fact that like that was happening 6 years ago, and we're still seeing the same exact results after peaceful protests, right? So that's why people are angry, and I got to like speak to my dad in terms that he understood, and he had really this nice moment where he was like, yeah, I think I was pretty ignorant back then to what he was actually trying to do or trying to accomplish, and that does make sense to me. And then the other thing is that I know my dad doesn't read. For example, my dad doesn't like to read articles or books. Like if I send him White Fragility, it's gonna collect dust, right? But I know that he'll watch a video with me, or I can send him like the Trevor Noah video and say, hey, I would really like it if you would watch this, and can I call you and talk to you about it later, right? And so that's all to say that we know how to speak to the people within our networks, and get the point across. Maybe we don't always know the best way to do that, but we know how to approach it with love and kindness and care, right? And when you're coming at it from there, it's a lot easier to enter into a teachable moment that maybe elevates someone up to prison abolition, right? If they're not there at their entry point. But but we know how to do that because we know our community members. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking of older generations, is like, what entry level are they at, and how can I talk to them in a way that makes sense to them, to move them from that entry point to a little bit further up that ladder.
Yeah, it's really about meeting people where they are, right? And I think that's part of why we thought this was an important opportunity, is because people are coming at this movement from all over the place, right? There are people who understand what prison abolition means and defunding the police means, and there are people who are just like, you know, worried that their daughter is going to get, you know, mixed up into something because they don't have any concept of like the, you know, the systems in which we're competing and working against. So to that point, there's another question in the chat that it might need a little bit of expansion, but somebody asked, I'd like to focus my time on changing racist laws and policies. Can you please advise? I guess that really depends on like what your position is, and if you're a citizen, if you're somebody that's within, you know, the you know, municipal structures. But I think if either of you guys have a take on that, and like how best to serve the movement.
Well, it's interesting because there's a hell of a lot of racist ways that people have ended up in prison, and laws have begun to change, but it doesn't mean that people retroactively automatically get out of prison. So one place, if you're like, where's some huge gaping holes? Crack drug laws that put huge amounts of people of color in prison for long sentences. There's a lot of people in prison for that. For a long time, if you don't know, there was 100-to-1 crack to cocaine law. So you needed 100 times more cocaine than crack to go to prison for the same amount of time. In many places, those laws have changed. Like I said, it doesn't mean that people get out of prison. Also, in California, for a long time, we had 3 strikes. It means that if you had 2 crimes that fell into like particular kind of like violent categories, 2 felonies, it didn't matter what your 3rd felony was. So, you know, I know guys who like, they had felonies as kids, they were gang related, later got out of the gangs in their 40s, you know, or walking down the street, got stopped and frisked, but cops found drugs on them. And that, so it doesn't matter what your 3rd strike is. So they, you know, as a result of $10, $20, $50 worth of drugs in their pocket, are in prison for life. So if there's lots of work there about like, what would it look like to get all those people out, all those people who are in for a nonviolent 3rd strike, all those people who are in for crack. There's also a lot, you know, other places where I see like extreme injustice in terms of laws and the way laws work. The way marijuana licensing right now, the people who are getting the licenses to do dispensaries or to even grow weed, in many places there are people who are former law enforcement. That's a huge new market. It's not a market that is effectively being you know, made accessible to Black and Brown and Indigenous people. Also, the kind of capital that you need many times to get, sometimes the actual like application can be a $20,000, $40,000 thing. So the beginning part of it can be crazy. Mind you, what are the communities that have been the most effective, the most impacted by the war on drugs? And, you know, by being stopped for many times, no good reason, but then ended up with a drug charge, of course, it's Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And so, you know, policy, how can we get this weed economy to help get these people out of prison who were there on weed? How can the people who've made the most money on illegal drug markets, like, look at, like, there's so many young white people who made hella money on weed. And those people aren't being held accountable at all, as they had plenty of money to shift into legal production. They're not being asked to take up any responsibility to get people out of prison. The Innocence Project does amazing work. If you're interested in them, Brian Stevens, he has been focusing on death row. Death row is an incredible place of really awful injustice that's, you know, punctuated by racism. There's a lot of people, innocent people on death row, and Black people get the death sentence far more likely than white people. I don't know, which laws aren't racist? So there's lots of places where you can go, but the drug sentencing, I mean, our prisons have exploded because of drugs. So, and the way that we've sentenced people around drugs, and then the over application of the war on drugs in communities of color. So, yeah, I mean, and the other thing is like really looking at which communities were using tons of money to incarcerate people. I mentioned this last time. There's this awesome project in Chicago, $1 Million Blocks. It shows mappings of the city where there are blocks where truly the government's using over $1 million per block to incarcerate people from that block. So, you know, what would it look like if we looked at those maps and we're like, hey, let's take those people out of prison and let's just invest, you know, a half or a third of that money that we were going to use to incarcerate people and invest in the block. So there's lots of places.
Also in housing, I think like that's a place that I look at a lot. First of all, evictions are disproportionately targeting Black, brown, and low-income folks. And in eviction courts, there's lots of defenses that tenants can have against their landlords, for example, or against their eviction. But they are not aware of what those defenses are. So if you have any sort of repair that needs to be taken care of, if you have infestation from like rodents, if you have shutoffs on your water for no reason without any notice, like all of these things, had they been documented, someone could show up to court and present that and be able to stay in their home. But also the flip side of that is that most evictions that happen are actually illegal. You get like a 7-day or a 5-day notice from your landlord, and they tell you, oh, we're going to file an eviction, or you can leave by the end of the week. And so a lot of people just don't, they think, oh, it's a done deal, like I just won't show up to court in the first place. And so I think like housing is a place that like if you're looking at policy work is a really good place to look, not even just for like evictions, but also foreclosures is a huge issue, especially in Detroit. And then also like the policies that exist for like different zoning areas and whether or not like multiple family homes can exist within a certain zoning area is often a very racist practice, and kind of was born out of the desire to keep Black, brown, and low-income folks out of neighborhoods. So I definitely think housing is a place to look for like policy change that would also affect schools, since we know that public schools are funded through property taxes. So those are what I would sort of suggest for that.
I think the other thing, housing, I'm so glad you mentioned housing. Housing's also a place where through real estate is how most intergenerational wealth is accrued. And so, you know, mostly the ways that white people have accrued wealth through generation is by passing down land and real estate. And that's something that has not been made available to so many people of color. So that is a really, really important space. And also the way mortgages work, when you look at the most recent housing, you know, the mortgage loan crash that we had, right? When you look at the policy, like there was actual policy like at Morgan Stanley where Black people were getting predatory mortgage loans. So there's lots of space within housing to think about it through racial lens.
Thank you both for that. There's a really interesting question in the Q&A, and I thought I'd start by answering it, and then see if you guys have anything you'd like to add to it, because it took me a minute to sit with it to really think about this. How would you go about speaking to a family member who spent many years in prison and came out with racist ideologies? I have tried opening conversations with resources, with links and videos. When confronted privately, they've ignored, and even confronted publicly on social media, comments are deleted. I think this is tricky, right? Like, talking to family members about their racism is like what all of us need to be doing right now. And it's something that I think lots of us struggle with. This specifically, I think, you know, the conversation around their time in prison is probably where to start, in terms of, like, I don't know if that's a triggering conversation that they might not be wanting to have, but thinking about, like, how do you broach that topic of, like, so you went in like one way and you came out another, like, what happened in there? Like, talk to me about your experiences, and get them to, like, talk about their life. I think a lot of times when people deal with racism, or they ignore it, or they don't know how to manage it, or they're, you know, like, pretending it's not there, it's because they have some very deep-rooted emotional issues that they won't look at, and they don't know how to address. And so maybe, while this sounds counterintuitive to the work, like, sometimes you have to show up for people emotionally when they're exhibiting racism, so that they are able to be vulnerable enough to talk about what's going on. Because, like, if you confront people and you're just attacking them, like, they get defensive and they shut down. Like, that's not a way to help them understand that what they're presenting is really disrespectful, not okay, you know, all of the things that come along with racist ideologies. But I think, you know, this sounds like there was probably a lot of trauma that happened to this person while in prison, and helping them process that can also help them to sort of unravel, you know, prisons are tough places, you know, like, you often end up in racially segregated gangs in a lot of these prisons. So, you know, like, that then gets sometimes literally beaten into you. So there needs to be a space where this person is comfortable having conversations about their experience, and you know, without, like, offering that humanity to them, it's going to be really hard for them to, like, want to watch a Trevor Noah video, right? Like, they're not going to do that. They don't care, because they probably have been really traumatized, and they probably had some really horrific circumstances and situations, you know, it's been experienced inside prison. So I would start there. Just kind of reach out as, like, a human to human, or a family member to family member, and just be like, you know, I'd love to talk to you about your experiences. Like, how can I help support you processing the trauma that you went through in prison? I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that.
I would agree. You know, I think over and over again, we see that gangs are a kind of coping mechanism that serve people in a lot of different kinds of ways. In all the prisons that I've worked in, they were completely segregated by gangs, and it was, you know, unless you were in a very, you know, low security yard, you pretty much had to join a gang when you went in, and gangs protect you. And so likely this person experienced feeling protected, feeling part of something, and, you know, like Anne said, prisons are really brutal places, and in the prisons where I've spent time, gangs moderate the way prison works. And so it makes sense to me that if they were in a prison, you know, and they had these kinds of experiences, that those experiences would then inform how they see things now. And I think it also just becomes like a conversation about, like, okay, so, like, that thinking served you in prison. Does it serve you here? And be empathetic to that, like, you know, racist thinking and, like, being in a gang does serve you in prison. It keeps you safe. It's not right. It's fucked up in a lot of ways. Prison's fucked up, but that's how you cope.
I don't have a lot of experience with prisons, but I definitely think that if again, like, if we're a trusted person or a trusted family member, like, it is our responsibility to make space, not to necessarily like tolerate or condone racism, right? But like to make space for like the human to human interaction, because that person is like experiencing trauma. And I think like shaming or attacking, like while you probably have a right to feel like very justifiably like angry about racist sentiment that may be coming from this person, taking a step back and coming back to that conversation, and not like forgetting about it, but coming back to that conversation when you're not going to be in a place of like rage, but in a place of like I can use this as a teachable moment, is going to be a lot more effective than further isolating and further shunning, because that's what prison does, right? Like prison isolates people from their networks, and that's not what a person leaving prison needs to encounter when they re-enter their networks and their community and their family.
And to that point too, oh, go ahead, Kate. No, okay, to that point, you first, honey.
Okay, just to add up on that, there is some great stuff about like what becomes possible in relationship. There's that great article, remember? It was like one of the KKK leaders' nephews, like was it at prison? I mean, was it prison? College. Was it college? And he ended up, I want to say his roommate was Jewish, and they completely deprogrammed the kid. He was like supposed to be the next leader of the KKK. Have you heard the story? I'll find it and share it. It's an incredible story, but it really shows how like the power of relationship, huge change happens within relationships.
Is his name Derek Black?
Maybe.
All right. I don't want to share anything without reading it, but we can.
Yeah, I'll do the research and I'll share it, but there's some good information.
Yeah, I think also to the point, and we'll wrap it up with this last comment, but I think to that point about like meeting people where they are on an emotional, I think it's really easy for white folks to be like, I'm going to meet people where they are on an intellectual level, but like we really need to be considering how we meet people on emotional levels. Like this example of somebody coming out of prison and being traumatized is, you know, a very specific example, but I do feel like there's a lot of people who aren't coming to this conversation because emotionally they are not prepared to really reflect on the decades of racism that they've carried on in their lives, and maybe they feel shame or maybe they don't, but like I think I struggle with this a lot with dealing with some folks that are not on the same side as I'm on, and I'm really struggling to like, how do I communicate with them in a way that is confrontational? Just doesn't work in this structure, in this relationship. So how do I meet somebody where they are emotionally and still be able to really like discuss this in a way that they can relate to and they can understand? And I think, you know, just because it's just a specific example of somebody being in prison, but I think in general, like the folks that are exhibiting racist behaviors and not owning it or recognizing it, I think we need to consider like, how do we speak to them on an emotional level? Because this is ultimately a very emotional thing, right? It's about power, it's about privilege, it's about all sorts of systemic things that we've just been, as white folks, entitled to. And I think a lot of people are very scared of losing that entitlement. And so that becomes a fear-based thing, which is an emotional response. So, you know, really considering how we respond to people in an emotional space, I think is, Kate's been talking about this for weeks, like, you know, we have to be reflecting on where we are emotionally as a nation, but I think that also then relates to how do we communicate on an emotional level to people who really need to be recognizing they got a lot of work to do, or they're not willing to see racism for what it is in their experiences and their responses to things.
And ultimately, I think also a feature of whiteness is isolation. And, you know, when you look at like, because a lot of things that we see now are stuff that comes from like early Protestant or Puritan culture. And so that kind of like shaming or isolating people, like that's some classic white shit we do. And that's also, it's like one of those things where like, it creates racism, but it's also why people are scared to let go of it. You know, like they've got their racist people. They're gonna like stick with it. You know, I mean that's in many ways how the police were formed. Is that the rich white people realized that lower class white people were at risk of unifying with the other people who were, you know, the people who ended up being the original police corps were like just have like a teeny tiny higher social status than people who are just newly coming out of slavery. And so property owners knew that they couldn't afford for poor white people to rise up against them in collaboration, right? And so it was like, how do we create this social status? So there's also like infinite ways in which we see largely rich white men can be convincing poor white people that everyone else is the problem. And in that, you know, for us to think about how can we think about that so that, you know, all of us at the bottom are looking towards the top to the problem, we can get somewhere. 6:01, guys, we did it.
Yeah, we did great. Good job keeping it timely. Thank you everybody for coming through tonight. We're going to be doing this every week at the same time. We're going to send you a newsletter if you don't want to just unsubscribe, but we're hoping that we can continue to have this conversation. Bring your questions, bring your thoughts, bring your friends, so we can keep this conversation going because we all have so much work to do.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank
everybody.
you.
See you later.
Till next time.